Total War Warhammer 3 is coming out in 2022. I have not a single leak to cover, at least at present, but in the meanwhile, at least we're slowly being drip-fed information on the great lands of Cathay, a Warhammer first. And there was also some interesting stuff about the Border Princes recently, so heads up for that. That's for all you Southern Realm fans. But in the meanwhile, there are a few topics I've actually wanted to cover, and I feel like now would be a pretty good time. So if anyone ever brings up a piece of obscure Warhammer trivia to you ever again, you'll be ready. You'll be locked and loaded. You'll know exactly what to say. I really need to stop going off script. I don't think it's working out too well. This is going to be the start of a series I'm dubbing Warhammer Fact Files. It's going to be obscure, possibly non-canon lore from either the old days of Warhammer Fantasy or perhaps even just Warhammer 2 and hopefully Warhammer 3. I also wanted to make a couple of quick shoutouts. I'd like to thank Bungus for the wonderful commission they did of my new PFP. A lot of people call me Goose, so I was kind of like, what if you combine this robot and Goose? And I did not make the greatest sketch, but they made it work, and it looks amazing, so thank you. I'd also like to thank all the people on the research team. Of course, we have head researcher Mr. Marvelous from the Total War Discord. You can catch him there doing whatever they do. And a couple other people actually, but seriously, I don't think I'd be able to make this kind of content without the help that I've been given, and I really appreciate it. Alright, enough sentimental stuff, we're going right into today's topic, which is of course, Mengil's Manflayers, led by Mengil Manhide. Now this may seem like your typical aloof Dark Elf rogue army, but there's actually a lot of lore here. So Mengil himself is a character that appeared in White Dwarf number 298. Just a heads up for my Total War playing brethren who've never touched a tabletop in their lives. White Dwarf is a hobby magazine that had all sorts of goodies having to do with the hobby itself and their games. Namco! His backstory is essentially that he's a cannibalistic, skin-flaying psychopath, which cannibalistic's a bit odd because I believe that elves aren't humans. I don't know if that infers he eats elves. I think the idea was that he eats humans because he kind of just chills in Talea now. But this isn't as it seems, dear viewer. This is an attempt to make things seem simple, which they are not. This is actually some sort of weird mind game that Games Workshop was playing to troll me 17 years in the future. So although this is probably his most well-known appearance, he's actually appeared about 3 times. Alright, here's my attempt at the fast version. The 2004 White Dwarf article was, in itself, and especially in lore, a callback to the 1985 July release of Mengil's Manhides, which actually were previewed in 1984. They were then redesigned and re-released in October of 1985. So there are 2 80s releases of Mengil's company, which were known as Mengil Manhide's Dark Elf Company, amongst other names. And then, in 2004, they were previewed in a White Dwarf article and seemed to be released for the 2005-2006 Warhammer Complete Catalog. So there are 3 different Mengils. I gotta say, the first one is not completely outstanding, so I can kind of see why he was remade, but of all the just random throwaway characters, I think there are legendary lords in Warhammer 2 that actually have less models, less lore, and everything else than Mengil. But ultimately, his lineage seems to trace back to the very roots of the Warhammer Fantasy game itself. Mengil's entry in the Forces of Fantasy Volume 2 book from 1st edition, from his 1984 entry to his 2004 entry, it's always stated that he is the son of Krull Hearteater. And Krull Hearteater is actually a reference to an earlier model from 1982, the Night Elf Patrol set. Yes, the Night Elf Patrol set. This is presumably when Citadel was still selling miniatures for use in RuneQuest and D&D. So the thing is that I've seen different sources give different dates, but the release of the 1st edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles is sometimes given as 1983 and sometimes as 1982, which means Krull Hearteater may potentially be older than Warhammer Fantasy Battle itself, meaning Mengil Manhide is the son of a character that predates Warhammer. Not only that, Krull Hearteater is said to be a lord who hails from Klar Karand, which is a minor faction in Total War Warhammer 2. There's just so much here, it's all compounded into this big bundle of lore. I don't know if we've ever seen a rogue army leader be promoted to legendary lord status in Warhammer 2, but I think Mengil Manhide is a pretty suitable candidate. Or if there was potentially a Dogs of War faction given his relation to them in 5th edition, that White Dwarf issue. Also, as a quick aside, Regiments of Renown in the tabletop are much different than how they're implemented in Total War Warhammer 2. They're more like a mercenary company with a named leader, a battle cry, some fun little stats. Something that definitely complicates the potential inclusion of Dogs of War in the future of Total War Warhammer. I've taken the liberty of capturing a real Dark Elf to recite the lore bits. I wanted to save it for the end as they're somewhat long. For any of you who are curious as to the full blurb that is Mengil's backstory, I'm going to play that out now. I also wanted to say that I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I have a couple other topics I plan to cover. There's one that I definitely know that I want to do next that is a really obscure part of Warhammer Fantasy. Something so cursed, I think I shan't name it here.
Mengil Manhide's company of dark elves. During the spring of his last year, Kral the Heart-Eater gathered about him all the young men of his immediate family. Spells were cast, bloody sacrifices were made, and at last the young elven warriors were initiated into their family cult. At the completion of the ceremony, Kral banished all of the young elves, expelled them from the forest, and forbade them to return until each had slain a human warrior, or died in the attempt. This was the way of the dark elves of Kral's family. Mengil, son of old Kral, had never before strayed from the dank, leafy confines of his forest home. He soon acclimatized to his new social role, however, and discovered that he liked the marauding life so much that he decided against returning to his father's people and set out on a life of banditry and mayhem. His first victim was a huge Norse champion. His skin Mengil fashioned into a cloak, establishing both the mode of dress of his followers and his full name, Mengil Manhide. Mengil Manhide is the sadistic, cannibalistic leader of a vicious group of dark elves known throughout the old world as the Man-Flayers. They travel unseen across the lands under the cover of darkness, selling their savage skills to the highest bidder and adorning themselves with the flayed flesh of those they slaughter in battle. Even amongst the dark elves of Nagaroth, a nation renowned for its cruelty, ruthlessness, and sadistic tendencies, Mengil of Klar Karond is particularly noted for his bloodthirsty nature. Such is his cunning and his gleefully murderous behavior that many amongst the dark elves regard him as an unhinged killer. While most dark elves would happily slit the throat of any who got in their way in order to further their own political aims or gain more personal power so long as they could get away with it, Mengil kills for the fun of it, without care or thought of the consequences. On more than one occasion, he has slain allies merely on a whim, and many believe he has only a tenuous grip on his sanity. He is seen as dangerously unpredictable and regarded with suspicion and distrust by other dark elves. Mengil's father, Kral the Heart-Eater, was a cruel and powerful noble lord of Klar Karond, whose ruthless reputation ensured that none would dare to oppose him. He frequently set his sons tasks and trials as they were raised in order to weed out those he deemed too weak to carry his bloodline, and to test their loyalty to him. Those that failed his cruel tasks were slain without mercy, their hearts cut out and offered to Kain. His youngest son Mengil was no exception, and he was routinely beaten and forced to fight his older brothers. In one such test, Kral released a human captive, a powerful young Norseman, into the black forest outside of the Dark City, giving the warrior weapons and shield. The young Mengil was sent to hunt this human, and only once he returned with evidence of the kill would he be allowed back into the city. Through the icy wilderness, Mengil tracked his quarry, eventually coming face to face with the Norseman. His speed and skill with the blade was enough to overcome his larger and more powerful foe, and he rejoiced in the thrill of the kill, smeared blood across his face, and he drank deeply from the powerful heart of his fallen foe before skinning the Norseman and eating his flesh. While in the wilds, he sharpened his teeth to points, making him look particularly fearsome. Walking back in the Klar Karond, Mengil wore the bloodied skin as a cloak, earning him the respect of his father and the honorific title Manhide. The favoritism that Kral showed for his youngest and most vicious of sons was regarded jealously by his brothers, and on more than one occasion Mengil was forced to fight for his life against his brethren, killing 2 of his murderous siblings in one night. He ripped the skin from their bodies and had their bloodied, skinless corpses delivered to his one remaining brother as a warning. When he was old enough, Mengil joined the ranks of the Corsairs of Klar Karond, and his rapid rise was tarnished only by his increasing viciousness and unpredictability. Where his superiors would have him conduct lightning-quick raids, slaughtering any defenders, and retreating with captives before a strong defense could be formed to counterattack, Mengil would more often than not stubbornly refuse to retreat and strike at a larger defensive force. While his skill, ferocity, and powerful leadership would often ensure that he was victorious, he would generally return with few slaves, for he took perverse pleasure in killing. Even those who gave up their swords, Mengil would slay, rejoicing in the flow of blood and often continuing to hack and cut at the bodies long after life had left them. He continued his practice of skinning his defeated foes, and his father's halls in Clark-Arrond were bedecked with these savage trophies reaped from all over the world. Nevertheless, this was merely a slight blemish upon his otherwise praiseworthy name, and the fact that he would sometimes turn on an ally and brutally murder him in cold blood was seen more as an eccentricity than a problem. Within half a century, Mengil was himself leading the majority of raids launched from the Black Ark known as the Citadel of Spite. This was once a massive castle that guarded the southwestern tip of the now sunken lands of Nagarith, before it was turned into a giant floating fortress by dark magics. The Dark Lord of Clark-Arrond himself gave Mengil the honor of leading these assaults from the front, making him one of the youngest slave captains of any Clark-Arrond Black Ark. Over the next 2 decades, the Citadel of Spite became much hated by the High Elves, synonymous with despair and grief as it routinely raided Ultuan's coast and shipping lanes, as well as raiding the coasts of Norska, Bretonia, Araby, and Estalia. Though the Black Ark did not often return with many living slaves once Mengil had done with them, the terror that his brutal raids spread was regarded as pleasing to his superiors. For a time, the Citadel of Spite controlled the entrance to the Telean Sea, preying upon smugglers, pirates, and merchants alike, and routinely slaughtering the villages to the south of Remas, and near the pirate city of Sartosa. While engaged on land on one of these raids, the Black Ark came under attack by swift-moving elven ships from Lothern, and the Black Ark was forced to retreat to deeper waters. The captain of the Black Ark, who had seen his 3 predecessors slain in a mad rage by Mengil, was disinclined to return for the vicious warrior, and claimed that he was dead. Mengil and his men were stranded in Telea. They made their way inland under the cover of darkness, moving into the forests, and then into the southern Appuccini Mountains. After a season of preying indiscriminately on passing merchants and their hired guards, Mengil was approached by a wealthy warrior merchant from Verezzo. He struck a deal with Mengil, and thus began the Dark Elf's new career as a paid killer. He is often used by those who wish to make an example of the target, for Mengil takes savage pleasure in skinning his foes, often leaving the skinless bodies of his victims hanging from trees or impaled on spikes in the ground. For many years he fought on the side of his old comrade, the renegade Dark Elf known as Ian Hawkbane, until Mengil gutted, skinned, and ate him one night, after a disagreement. Throughout the lands of the Old World, Mengil has plied his trade, and his Dark Elves, known as the Man-Flayers, are rightly feared. They are employed as assassins and murderers, and are often used to eliminate rivals. Mengil took to the life as a hired killer with joyous abandon, and has even returned to Nagaroth several times when the Dark Lords readily employ him to eliminate their foes. On one such return to Clark-Arrond, Mengil repaid the captain of the Citadel of Spite for abandoning him those years before, and the story of that unfortunate Dark Elf's demise is still told in dark tales. On occasion, Mengil's Man-Flayers will take to the field of battle, employed to infiltrate deep into enemy territory to spread terror and confusion.